Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 289, and we're going to talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. So, Martin Luther King Day is observed on Monday, but I might take the day off because I got a lot of work I have to do. Today was a really super long day. Uh, yeah. So I figured I would do my Martin Luther King Jr. speech to episode today, get ahead of everyone else's Martin Luther King Day podcast episode ahead of everybody else. But anyway, the I Have a Dream speech was made in Washington, D.C., in front of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. I'm going to not discuss Martin Luther King's life, his character. Uh, I mean, we could look at his politics, but I'm not an expert on the man. There are a lot of things out there that people will say, things that he did in his life, and they bring it up to undermine the message that he carried. Okay. And it's not like I want to cover that up, but there's a specific um, point that I want to make, right? Anyone could probably do the same to me, like highlight some of the mistakes that I've done in my life and ignore all of the things that I've done to try to make up for them or repent of them. Not saying whether or not MLK did or didn't. That's not the point. Let's talk about his ideas. And this is why I take care and am careful about hero worship. Um, Whenever anyone, particularly the media or politicians, elevate a person, generally there's always some sort of cover up and problems which come out later, which other people try to bury, but which inevitably will tarnish the actual message, right? And so there's this association between the message and the messenger, and I want to disassociate that, right? I don't want the message necessarily to be associated with one single person. So I want to focus on the message. This is all setting up what I'm about to do, right? So regardless of the vehicle or the messenger, the message is the key. Now, I might do a different speech in the future, or even in the future make an episode to comment on his character and his life. But, like I said, I'm not an expert on the man, and I don't really care to be an expert. Okay. I just simply don't have that much time. Rather, I just want to focus on the ideas. Okay. And just keep it simple that way. Right. I mean, because whoever gave this speech could have been someone completely different. Does it mean then that the impact and the message and the point of the speech is somehow different because a different person gave it? No, no. I believe that the speech was powerful because of the message that it contained. And so let's look at the speech. I'm not going to read it all, even though it's not that long. Episodes are I just don't have time to do it. So I'm going to summarize it for you here, and not even a detailed summary, but to highlight certain things that I'd like to talk about. So he begins the speech. He talks about, he hints about Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he's standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. So obviously he's referring to Lincoln, and he talks about the Emancipation Proclamation, which is what Lincoln did while he was in office. And problematic as it was, and you can criticize it in many different ways, and if you're Thomas DiLorenzo of the Mises Institute, then you know that Lincoln himself is a problematic figure. But nevertheless, in the grand scheme of things, Emancipation Proclamation, probably a big step towards ending slavery. Although one might argue that, the war could have been avoided, but there it is. And so then well, commentary I'll say for later. So then he talks about how 100 years after Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. There's segregation, there's discrimination, there's poverty in the midst of national prosperity. And so the African American is an exile in his own land. And so they came to the capital to, quote, cash a check. So, cash a check for unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He did not advocate for violence. He urges people to realize that not all whites are racist. He refuses to believe that the Bank of Justice, where he's going to be able to cash his check of unalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, he refuses to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt, right? And so that he wants their riches of freedom and security of justice, okay? Emphasis, okay, that's a quote. He wants the riches of freedom and security of justice. And then here's a quote. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, end quote. And he continues, I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Okay. And so he goes on and he elaborates on all the different situations where he's dreaming that no longer will people be judged by their skin, but by their character, because they have now the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then he, of course, ends by saying, wouldn't it be awesome on that day, everyone, no matter religion, color, creed, they all hold hands and sing the Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last. Okay. Very cool speech. I know my father himself, he told me that his speeches were so good. I believe it was, I forget which speech it was, but he watched a broadcast of one of his speeches. And after the speech, he said, man, that speech is so good. He is going to be assassinated. And sure enough, that's what happened. Uh, so anyway, so let's comment on uh, the points that of the message, right? So again, it's not so the messenger was assassinated, but the message itself persists. Okay. So I already said the Emancipation Proclamation, it's not what a lot of people think it was, right? I have to emphasize to students that it did not free all slaves in the United States and the Confederate States, but only in the Confederate States. And so there were states in the Union which still had slavery, hence the whole Juneteenth thing. But also border states still had slaves as well. I believe there were four states which still had slavery, and they were part of the North, and they were able to have their slaves. But that also ended, but much later. So the Civil War was not about slavery. Otherwise, you know that the northern states would have, would have said that all states, no matter what, they would have to liberate their slaves. He talks about segregation, but segregation was not everywhere, not in every state, but only in certain states. And even in a lot of these states, not in every single place where you would find, people, black and whites, living together. You're not going to see segregation everywhere. And discriminatory laws were not universal. And so I did a little casual research about Jim Crow laws in the United States. And someone had typed up like all the sort of race-related laws and regulations throughout the land. And a lot of them were about marriage. Martin Luther King Jr. himself, in his letters home when he was going to school in the North, described the North as a much, much different place. He can go to restaurants. He can, and not fear being assaulted or being told that he's not allowed because of the color of his skin. And there even is a story where he wanted to marry a white girl, right? German, uh, the daughter of a German immigrant. But it was because of his family didn't want him to, and that if he was in a mixed marriage, that he would never become a senior pastor of a church in the South, and so they asked him not to, and apparently broke his heart. So there were a lot of laws regarding race and discrimination, but a lot of them was about marriage, mixed marriage, which today you can see uh, is not it's not a law, right? The government doesn't concern itself with that, and so he wants the enforcement of rights. In other words, he wants rights of everyone to be had, right? So to not have rights denied to people. In other words, he didn't want reparations. He didn't march on Washington to cash a check of reparations. He wanted justice. He wanted inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, he wanted freedom, right? And he emphasizes that. He puts a fine point on it, right? Free at last. That's what he wants. He wants freedom. And the reason is because sometimes it is the color of your skin, which is a big factor in decisions that need to be made. And I've talked about this several times in my race episodes, but some people prefer certain people based on their skin. So, I mean, think about the whole mixed marriage thing. I've talked about this before, where people who are involved in interracial relationships, generally what they say is, I don't see color, right? Which is a cop out, right? Because generally that person will, uh, actively try to date people of that race. And so, in other words, yeah, race is an issue, right? And so, but we're not allowed to say that. And so we say it's not an issue, you see. And so I always try to make the argument that, in fact, someone is attracted to someone because of their skin color, right? And so that's that discrimination, right? They're discriminating in favor of a certain color over another, a certain ethnicity over another, and there's nothing wrong with saying that, right? It's just, people will have their preferences, right? So instead of saying that skin is never an issue, which is not the case, but that sometimes it is the very issue, right? And we live in a society now where somehow that is problematic to say, even though it's true. And so people have to come up with these lame, nonsensical excuses to hide the fact that what matters to them is something which is politically incorrect. So he wants freedom. That's how he ends his speech, right? Freed at last. Thank God, free at last. So freedom to live is also the freedom to fail. So let's just say if people had all this freedom, but they abuse the freedom, use their freedom irresponsibly, then yeah, they're not going to change their situation. Maybe they'll make their situation even worse, right? So the freedom to live does not mean the freedom of guaranteed success. No, that's not it, right? Freedom means also the freedom to fail. And so what we can see then is that there are certain people who want to use the power of the state to guarantee this freedom. Okay, they're going to use the mechanism of the state, the laws of the state, to somehow pull this off. But of course, as we know that how government works, they will co-opt the movement to maintain the status quo, right? And so if you look, even though the Civil Rights Act was passed, right? What has changed other than the psychological thing and lawsuits that now you can sue people for certain things? But even that does not mean that life has gotten better, right? It has actually become a drain on society. The legal fees, having to buy insurance for, discriminatory violations, things of this nature. You know, is it better or has our society gotten worse? And so just think about welfare, right? So he talked about poverty in the midst of all this prosperity. Well, has anything really changed? Well, now you're paying people to stay poor. You're paying people to be generationally poor through the welfare trap, right? So is that a better situation? To have families broken, to incentivize people separating, breaking families up so that they can qualify for welfare? Is that a good thing? I don't think so, right? And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was passed with all of this momentum of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, right, is probably more detrimental because it's a government regulation. We know already that if you want to know the nature of a government regulation, you take the opposite of what it's named. So the Civil Rights Act is not there for the civil rights of oppressed people. No, it's to squash it, right? To make it even more difficult for discriminated people to have rights. I don't think, it's not my opinion that being able to sue someone because you suspect racism, right, which is illegal, is a good thing. I don't think that that is a good thing because now you have a lot of frivolous lawsuits. Now you have a lot of people who have no grounds to sue now have justification for sue. So there's a downside to this to all of this, and it is a net drag on society. You can also see this in other regulations that were passed. Net neutrality is not about net neutrality, but about preserving oligopoly. The Patriot Act is nothing to do with patriotism. Rather, it's all about government surveillance into our lives. The TikTok ban, I am sure, has very little to do with TikTok, right? But more has to do with government surveillance, our loss of privacy, right? In addition to trying to bankrupt some Chinese people and their ownership of that company and basically giving it to Americans for pennies on the dollar, right? So the legislation is named in such a way that it tricks people into thinking that they're doing something good when in reality, all that's happening is they're losing their freedom. So if you look at the Civil Rights Act, right, there are a lot of desegregation of public school content in that Civil Rights Act. And you might be saying, oh, it's desegregation. That's a great thing. No, what would have been better would have been school choice, right? Desegregation maintains funding of public schools. And so the public schools get to stick around. Okay. So it protects the discriminatory structure that was in place, right? So you pass all these desegregation laws, and all of the people who were in favor of segregation keep their jobs. Okay. And that's not what we want. We want people to be punished. We want people to be forced to reevaluate their life choices. And if there was school choice and therefore, funding of public schools was conditional on whether or not students chose to go to that school, well, see, now you see a totally different dynamic. And so if you fast forward to today, what do you see? Do you see desegregated schools? Well, if you go out to the suburbs, depending on the neighborhood, you can see a lot of people going to school, very diverse. But you go into the city, go into the poorer neighborhoods, and there's no desegregation. It's like segregation all over again, except segregation according to wealth, right? Which generally works out racially as well. And so that's kind of what I mean. So they push for desegregation. Yay, we're going to do something good. No, you have preserved the discriminatory structure. So eventually you'll just go right back to the way things were, except worse. Because the quality from anecdotal, what a lot of people will say, including Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, the predominantly black schools in the 1960s were a much higher quality and level than they are today. Okay. And so things are much, much worse than they were with the passing of the Civil Rights Act. I hope you understand what I'm trying to convey here. So I'll go further. What would have been better also, instead of the Civil Rights Act, is just simply repealing all these laws instead of adding and having more laws which muddy the waters, which sneak in all these other discriminatory things, which maintain the status quo. No, just repeal everything. Repeal these Jim Crow laws. Allow people to discriminate as they wish. Bad ideas always lose. Good ideas always rise to the top. I just talked about schools, how desegregation maintained the racist structure of these schools, the bad racism that they practice. And so we're right back to where we started, except even worse in terms of quality of education. Instead of talking about racism in busing, no, repeal all of the public transportation contracts, right? End the monopolies in public transportation. And if we did that, then no one would know Rosa Parks's name, right? Because if her the bus company that she was riding said all African Americans have to give up their seat and move to the back of the bus, she was just ride a different bus. And so that company that said black people have to give up their seats, they would go bankrupt. Okay. And so what you need is to repeal monopolies, repeal public transportation contracts, which are monopolies, government protected monopolies. That would have had a far better effect than these sort of anti-discrimination laws. Repealing Jim Crow laws means that some businesses will allow black patrons and other businesses will say whites only. Okay. And if you have a situation like that, where is everyone going to go to eat? They're going to go to the places that serve everybody. There was this documentary I saw about Asians in the South, right? So Chinese and mostly Chinese going to like places like Mississippi and Alabama and setting up restaurants and general stores, groceries, and they served anyone, right? And so blacks would come to their establishments, but because they were Asian, you see, a lot of whites might not have gone. But in a world where there is no Jim Crow, then you probably would see lots of people going to the establishment that had better service, better tasting food, et cetera, better selection. And so repealing that would have allowed people then to shop where they want and allow the best business owners to succeed. And so Martin Luther King pushed for freedom and it turned into political activism. And I know this because when I was doing my dissertation, as I said before, I felt like I was supposed to make a conclusion that included all this, all these proposals for government legislation. And I realized that that's hypocritical. That's not a solution that's going to make the problems worse. And so for Martin Luther King Jr., I guess for him in his mind, political activism, if that indeed was his goal, right? It wasn't co-opted. It wasn't given to him, right? Because if you push for freedom, you don't need political legislation. You don't need government legislation. You just have to fight for repealing lots of things. All right. And so all of his work and effort went towards regulation, the Civil Rights Act, as if it was the goal. And of course, even after it's passed, the fight's not over, you see, because it wasn't the solution. And so if he pushed for freedom and all these laws got repealed, right, all these unjust laws got repealed and people had their rights restored, then you would see some really huge change. But that's not how the story went, right? But his idea of pushing for freedom, that is awesome. That is beautiful and would have gotten him in trouble today, right? Don't be judged by the color of your skin, but by the content of your character. This is, you know, not permitted today anymore, right? In a very odd turn of events. And so that's the problem of pushing for government action, political action, civil rights, or like government regulations like the Civil Rights Act, you end up with more problems. Okay. And so you just have to try to get rid of the existing ones and just see the creativity, all of the ideas and the industry, the effort, the creativity of people just come to the fore, be seen, be recognized, and embraced. And that would have been a much, much better, um, you know, goal or conclusion to this kind of civil rights movement. At least it's what I push for. It's a much harder sell, but it does end up with fewer issues and problems. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will talk to you next week.